we'll start with this. Well, Estelle Mossely of La France posted this via her Instagram account, and it reads, "Delighted to announce my new signing with Probellum. Happy to join Richard Schaefer and his team. Can't wait to start this adventure together. I'm really honored to announce my new signature with Probellum. Happy to join Richard Schaefer's team and ready to write new chapters together." That is Olympic gold medalist Estelle Mossely, who I think with this signing won't be fighting exclusively out of France anymore. Exclusively on Tony Yoka's undercards the way she used to. Those two have since split. They got a divorce.
Yeah, that sucks.
But not for Estelle Mossely, who has paired up with Probellum. I think what this means is Estelle is going to do a lot more traveling, a lot more opportunities for Estelle Mossely, who I've always felt has been on the fringe of the lightweight division, not fighting the familiar faces 135 pounds has to offer.
She's just been kind of on the outskirts.
Kind of like Nicole Wessner and Ramona Cohen. Granted that Estelle Mossely hasn't been a professional anyways near as long as they have. All the same, they're fighting a very similar level of opposition, similar level of competition. You wonder, when exactly is Estelle Mossely going to challenge for a world title?
Maybe this signing will give her career the kickstart it needs.
Estelle Mossely would be the second female fighter that Probellum has signed. They very recently announced they've signed Dina Thorsland, two-division WBO champion Dina Thorsland, who's currently campaigning as a bantamweight.
It's 118 pounds.
Estelle Mossely is a lightweight.
It's 135 pounds.
I expect to see more signings just like this one. I do, all around the world, involving fighters all around the world that exhibit the kind of talent that shows they can go all the way. For what it's worth, I still think Estelle Mossely has potential, even if she hasn't lived up to it. She still has time.
Yeah, she's 29 years old.
She's coming up on 30, sporting a professional record of 9 wins, no losses, no draws with 1 knockout. Perhaps this is the year where Estelle Mossely's career will...
Perhaps this is the year where her pro career takes off.
She fought 3 times in 2019, 2 times in 2020, only once last year in 2021.
Let's see if signing with Probellum don't result in a more productive schedule for Estelle,
who I anticipate may end up fighting in places like Dubai and other areas around the world, places where Probellum has forged partnerships with local promoters, local promotional outfits.
Yeah, they've been busy. They've been making friends.
It's a good signing, and I expect that there will be more signings just like this one. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a fighter like Firuza Sharapova, maybe a former undisputed champion in Cecilia Brækhus, also signing to Probellum. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Probellum pick up some more familiar faces and some established names.
Hey, just remember, these guys actually signed Dani Nietes.
That guy's fucking old, but they signed him. They're at a place where they're attempting to harvest talent, up-and-coming talent, as well as established fighters, established names. One or some former champions. They're in a place where they're harvesting what is to be their stable of fighters. They still are in the early stages of their...
This is just the beginning for them.
They have added a second Siren, a second Valkyrie to their Probellum stable of female fighters. I expect to see more signings just like this one, as there is no shortage of female talent, male talent, to go around all around the world. Congratulations to Estelle Mossely, and here's to having a more busy 2022 than 2021 was. In other news, the Mundo Boxing Gym seems to have started their own promotional company, and they're going to be staging a show next month on the 11th featuring social media star,
powerlifter turned pugilist,
Steffi Cohen, who made her professional debut last year. She had 2 fights last year. She racked up 1 professional victory and 1 professional draw.
Campaigning in the women's featherweight division.
Featherweight, that's where Amanda Serrano holds the WBC and WBO titles. Mexico's own Erica Cruz holds the WBA title, and Denmark's own Sarah Mahfoud holds the IBF title. Steffi Cohen on the 11th of next month will attempt to advance to a professional record of 2 wins, no losses, and 1 draw.
And what is a 4-rounder against an opponent that is yet to be announced.
Also fighting on that same undercard will be Russia's own Fatima Dudieva, who will attempt to advance to a professional record of 12-0. She's 11
wins, no losses, no draws.
Fatima Dudieva had a busier 2021 than most. She actually fought 4 times. I repeat, she fought 4 times last year. Let's see if this year she'll be just as productive, just as busy. One of Ring IQ's top prospects to watch in the previous year.
She's going to be in action in a 6-rounder against an opponent that is yet to be announced.
Back to Steffi Cohen, a very interesting figure in the sport, interesting fighter. because she must find the marriage between powerlifting and pugilism in order to be successful. And these are two very different disciplines, two very different sports. I'm curious to see if Steffi Cohen will achieve this.
As she approaches the upper echelon ranks,
She may have to shed some of that muscle she's worked so hard to build and become a more streamlined fighter.
what's needed to be a successful powerlifter ain't the same thing as what's needed to be a successful boxer.
They are very different sports, very different disciplines that require different forms of peak physical condition, respectively.
All this is set to go down in Miami next month on the 11th.
Available on Fight TV. Steffi Cohen's got about 200,000 subscribers on YouTube, 1 million followers on Instagram.
Having that kind of a following as you start your professional boxing career.
Most boxers ain't got a following like that until they're well into their professional career, having amassed that following throughout their professional career, whereas with Steffi Cohen, it's backwards. She's coming into the sport with that kind of a following, and that is very beneficial as there is a large audience that is already familiar with her.
It's a large audience of people you can market a fight to.
And that's part of what Steffi Cohen has working for her that most other boxers don't have working for them, that she already has an audience that's captivated with her and follow her. Thus,
From a marketing standpoint, she's in a good position.
she's returning to action next month on the 11th, and let's see what's next for her in her professional boxing career. We come to our weekend recap. Gary Russell Jr. versus Mark Magsayo, the fight that saw the green belt change hands from Gary Russell, the long-reigning champion,
Right.
absentee champion,
Right.
to Mark Magsayo, the unbeaten up-and-coming hopeful, now newly crowned champion. This fight was fairly simple to assess, fairly simple to evaluate. Put simply, Mark Magsayo outfought Gary Russell Jr. Mark Magsayo, who showed some glaring limitations in that fight, he did, but at the end of the day, he landed more punches round by round.
And that's how he beat Gary.
I think that a more active Gary Russell Jr. and a more able-bodied Gary Russell Jr. would have won this fight by out-hustling and out-thinking Mark Magsayo, who, I reiterate, showed a lot of limitations in there. But for what it's worth, Gary got hit a lot more than Mark, and that's what tells the story.
It's hard to make a case that Gary got robbed when Gary's getting hit more than the other guy.
That's the story that the punch stats tell, though I don't need the punch stats to tell me that story because I saw the fucking fight with my own two eyes. I saw that Gary Russell Jr. was defensively sound, but offensively, he was lacking. Gary Russell Jr. really was only fighting half of a fight.
Yeah, Gary's got more experience than Mark.
I think he's got better feet than Mark Magsayo for what it's worth, but it just didn't.
Didn't amount to much. You can't spend the whole fight on the run.
And there were entire spells where that's more or less what Gary Russell Jr. was doing, moving from one end of the ring to the other, not to set a trap, not to walk Mark Magsayo into a punch, but to retreat, to give up that real estate and try to stay out of harm's way as long as he could. Gary Russell Jr., who ahead of this fight stated he had some kind of an injury, an undisclosed injury that he wouldn't specify upon until after the fight.
Preemptive excuses?
No, I won't rush to judgment. I can believe that a fighter like Gary Russell Jr. may have very well come into this fight with an injury because Gary is not very active. There was something that Gary Russell said that caught my attention ahead of this fight, that he doesn't actually start sparring until he has a fight booked. He's talking about how that has helped to preserve him all these years. I thought about that, and I think about this injury, and I tell myself that, you know what, he probably got injured in sparring.
Oh, yeah, he probably got injured in sparring in preparation for this fight.
And the reason he got injured in sparring in preparation for this fight, I think, could be because he hasn't sparred in a long time. He hasn't fought in such a long time. The last time Gary Russell Jr. saw action was before COVID-19 shut the world down. Early 2020 against Tuksak Niambiar.
And I think it was Jimmy DeMarino that said it best.
Do you know what happens to a 33-year-old part-time boxer who goes into a championship bout after over 2 years out of the ring? Their shoulder gets punched out of the socket because they don't have the connective tissues of a fighter.
So whether Gary came into this fight with an injury,
He's telling the truth, or he became injured throughout the course of the match. I recall seeing Gary Russell Jr. languish in pain. I believe he hurt his right hand, his jab hand.
that's his jab hand because Gary's a southpaw.
Whatever the case may be, I can believe that a fighter, under these circumstances, a fighter like Gary Russell Jr., I can believe he came into this fight with an injury, but I believe that it's all Gary's own fault at the end of the day. In this life, it's use it or lose it, and Gary Russell Jr. hadn't had to use it in about 2 years.
Well, whose fault is that? Eddie Hearn offered him a fight.
Early last year to unify titles with the then reigning IBF champion, featherweight champion, Josh Warrington. Gary Russell Jr., in his own words, turned that fight down, said the payday was beneath him. I guess sitting out the entirety of last year was a better option, was a better idea. I happen to think that all this inactivity is not conducive towards staying sharp as a fighter, as a champion.
The more you do something, the better you are at it.
Can't say I didn't see this coming. Mark Magsayo spelled trouble for Gary Russell Jr., who I think, even last night, had better feet than Mark Magsayo. Mark showed he's a bit of a limited fighter.
There's room for improvement.
Watching this thing, I felt there were moments where if Mark Magsayo lands clean, he could possibly knock out or knock down at least Gary Russell Jr., but he couldn't fully capitalize because Gary's got better feet than Mark. Mark struggled with the angles, wary of the counters, what few counters Gary Russell Jr. fired, I should say.
That's the thing, Gary didn't mount much of an offense.
You're giving up real estate, constantly moving around that ring, and while you're doing this, you're still getting outthrown, you're still getting outlanded.
All the photo finish punches were coming from Mark Magsayo.
Don't misunderstand me, it's not like Mark wasn't missing punches, he was missing punches. It's just that even with missing shots here and there, he was still landing more often than Gary, throwing more than Gary. So to the eye, he's outworking this guy. He is out fighting him.
Some misguided fools calling this a robbery.
Well, the most rounds I could give Gary Russell Jr. in this fight were maybe, I don't know, 2, 3.
The judges ringside had this thing a lot closer than I did.
I had Gary losing this thing wide. Better still, the right man won the fight. Gary Russell Jr. just didn't do enough to hang on to the green belt.
Mark's got limitations, but he fought the better fight.
Moving Gary Russell Jr. from one end of the ring to the other, placing sneaky body shots whenever he closed the gap when was able to get close to him.
So ends the long reign of Gary Tussle Garden Gnome Russell Jr.
It's good riddance to bad rubbish as far as I'm concerned. Gary Russell Jr.'s reign as champion didn't do this division any favors, didn't bring much attention to it, create much buzz, or create much excitement.
The hope is that Mark will be a more active champion than Gary was.
I mean, whose bright idea was it for Gary Russell Jr. to keep such a sparse schedule of activity? Was it his own idea or his management's?
I don't know. Either way, it's finally caught up to him.
I ain't gonna hold y'all. Politics is a bad motherfucker. You know what I'm saying? I beat that boy at least 10 rounds to 2, 9 to 3, man. Man, took old boy to school, man. I don't know, man. It is what it is, man. I just wanted to come on here and show y'all some love, man. To the real supporters, you know what I'm saying? To the real fans, man. I appreciate it. Y'all seen what it was, man. They been trying to get a nigga out the way, I guess. I don't know. But it is what it is, man. To the fans, man, I appreciate y'all. You know what I'm saying? I'm a true dog at the end of the day, though. I been fucked my arm up like 2 weeks before the camp. You know what I'm saying? We put the work in. Still fought. And to be honest with you, I outclassed them, outschooled them, outboxed them with one motherfucking arm, man. One arm, I got a whole torn tendon in my shit, man. This shit mean, man. To the fans, I appreciate the love, appreciate the support. Y'all know what time it is, man. Stay tuned, man. Stay tuned. Appreciate y'all, man.
That's right, ladies and germs. Gary Russell Jr. has resorted to the same kind of willful ignorance and denial. Something similar to what we saw from Deontay Wilder when he was beaten, when he was outclassed by Tyson Fury. I'll say that Magsayo versus Russell Jr. was a closer fight than that one was. I mean, Tyson Fury trashed him the last 2 fights.
He did.
Whereas Gary showed that he's got better feet and better defensive prowess than Mark Magsayo, but that was only half the fight. Gary wasn't throwing enough.
He was only fighting half a fight.
Listen, it's not ring generalship when you're the guy whose back keeps ending up on those ropes. It's not ring generalship when you're being guided around that squared circle like a log down a stream. It's not ring generalship when you're being outlanded by the other guy. Even if the other guy is missing a lot of shots, he's still landing more shots than you are, throwing more shots than you are, so he is out fighting you.
Gary claims he outboxed the guy.
Generalized term that's often overused that in no way, shape, or form describes the aesthetic of this fight. Now, Gary didn't outbox anybody by getting hit more than Mark did.
And what becomes of Gary?
Who gives a flying fuck? What, is he going to be a more active boxer now that he's not a champion, as opposed to when he was a champion, when he did have a belt? When's the next time we're going to see Gary Russell Jr. in the ring? Should we expect a rematch?
Gary says it's It's politics.
Well, crying about an injury, a nagging injury, so what costed you the fight? Was it the injury or the politics, or both?
Vasyl Lomachenko's shoulder injury was no excuse for him losing that Teofimo Lopez fight.
It's what I told you guys after that fight. And after this fight, the same applies to Gary Russell Jr. Maybe a more able-bodied Gary Russell Jr.
Yeah, if his shoulder's not injured, maybe he can win a fight.
Is he going to shoot for a rematch, or is he going to take another 12 months off?
Let him go away. Let him be in denial.
Who needs him? That title changing hands could very well be the best thing that has happened to the featherweight division in a long time, because boxing don't need champions like Gary Russell Jr. Inactive champions, absentee champions.
Get him out of here.
You know, ahead of this fight, Gary Russell Jr. had a lot of things to say about not fighting more often because he's being avoided, when in reality, there's only one guy I can wholeheartedly say avoided Gary Russell Jr., and that's Leo Santa Cruz. And I do think Leo Santa Cruz avoided Gary Russell. I do think he ducked him, I do, but that's one guy. That's just one guy, one champion in a division where there are 4 active reigning world champions. What did Gary Russell Jr. do to pursue the other 2 unification matches with the other 2 champions at this weight?
Absolutely nothing.
That sparse schedule of activity that Gary Russell Jr. kept hurt him in more ways than one. It doesn't help his ability to perform, to stay sharp, but it didn't help his marquee value either. You're not making yourself any kind of a financial incentive for a Leo Santa Cruz or anybody else to want to have a fight with you.
Canelo Alvarez, the cash cow of boxing, fights more often than you do, so what's your excuse?
Gary Russell Jr. has exhibited a minimalist approach to his pro boxing career, and last night, a minimalist approach to trying to win a boxing match by simply not doing enough.
How many fucking times I gotta tell you, that bullshit doesn't work?
That fucking bullshit does not work.
Hey, let's see if he shoots for a rematch. If he doesn't, then he can pipe down.
Why don't you just get the fuck out of here? Mark Magsayo has the belt now. The landscape at 126 pounds, it is beginning to change. The previous cycle, the previous crop of fighters and champions,
They're aging.
they are reaching their respective sell-by dates. Mark Magsayo is the newly crowned WBC champion, a fresh-faced youngster from the Philippines who shows potential, shows limitations as well, and let's see what kind of reign he has.
Let's see.